So welcome back. I think that how we'll proceed is ask people who have questions to come to one of the two microphones and queue up, rather than have me just kind of indicate people. I think that will be an efficient way to go. And so the floor is open for questions to our panelists and to our author.
Peter Tucson, oh, is that on? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Peter Tucson, IUPUI. Pertaining to the discussion before the break about whether ethnic or racial is a better term, I think about the work on what one might call religio-racist identity, the use of the Bible in particular in the construction of racist categories in American history. Stephen Haynes and Sylvester Johnson, among others, who've written on that subject. And Judith, you're writing about religio-racial identity rather than religio-racist identity. Some of it still drawing on the Bible, some of it actively repudiating the Bible as a narrative source. But the commonality between both religio-racist identity and religio-racial identity, well, it seems to me there are two commonalities. There's this narrative emphasis, or what my colleague Joseph Tucker Edmonds likes to call scripturalizing, telling a story, whether it's from the actual Bible or from some other source. But there's also an emphasis on descent, lineal descent. That's the curse of Ham in the racist identity, but it's various other constructions of racial descent in these new movements. And so it seems to me, isn't that latter element a justification for using the term racial rather than ethnic? And anyone can respond to that, but I guess I'm directing the question to Judith first.
I think that's a helpful way to think about it. We were also talking about how, this seems really loud, the diasporic scale is another way in which it might not fit so neatly in the ethnic context, but the scripturalization and lineal descent is definitely a characteristic of most of the movements. And one thing that I might have done differently, or may have written about, but it got cut out in the hundreds of pages that got cut out, is to locate these groups not only in the Great Migration, but in the period of the 1920s and in the wake of that, that kind of new wave of religio-racist movements. And so thinking, other people have made this argument, Nathaniel Deutsch has talked about the Nation of Islam's theology as a eugenics theology that just kind of flips some of turns the hierarchy upside down, but to locate them in a new moment of heightened concern about the national body and its borders, about racial categories. So in this sense, even if they are trying to make ethnic claims, they're doing it in a moment at which, they're just in the wake of Immigration Act of 1924, right, or it's around them. So there's just a lot of new racist and racialized ways of thinking about American identity that is swirling around these groups. And I think, I wish I had spent more time locating them that way. And I think the ways in which they're challenging race has to do, again, not only with the long history from before slavery through slavery to the early 20th century, but with that very powerful moment that resonates with things that conversations we're having now, or things we're dealing with now about who gets to be American and how religion and race figure into that. All right, all questions have been answered.
Hello, okay. My name's Danae Jacobson, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Notre Dame. I'll just confess I don't know very much about Afrofuturism. I know just a little bit, and a little bit familiar with Butler. I'm going to ask a question I don't know much about. Last year I was at a conference in Canada at the University of Ottawa, and it was about restoring religion in Canadian public life. And I went to a panel that was about Afrofuturism, and she was talking about how Canada has functioned as this, going back to like the end of the Underground Railroad, as this place of both mythic place but also real space. So I guess my question is, you talk in the book about geography, and there's clearly these groups are thinking about other places as part of how they're narrating their identity. But how much is this just an American story? Does it go elsewhere? Is it specifically American? Are there, I don't know very much, but are there other places that it goes? Of course there are the places they're Ethiopia and the other places they're drawing from, but does it go other places, or is this a particularly American story? I'm not sure that's a totally clear question, but it's kind of a geography, both mythic and physical.
Do you mean, are they imagining other places, or do their groups?
But I guess both. Do they have a little bit of both, but do they also actually go, is that a part of their imaginary, and do they go other places, or is it particularly American? Are these American movements? Does that make sense?
Another thing I had hoped to do better with is highlighting the influence of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in these movements. So in one sense, Marcus Garvey is the engine of so much of what happens here, that many of these groups reference him either as an influence, or as, for Father Divine, he's an enemy, which also makes him really important. But I was frustrated in thinking about this whole landscape in this period with how, Garvey arrives in the U.S. and suddenly he's like incorporated into African American history in a way that doesn't recognize either the particular religious context he came from in Jamaica or other kinds of political formations behind him. And so the Ethiopian Hebrew congregations are overwhelmingly Afro-Caribbean immigrants, and Father Divine's group has lots of immigrants as well, and also white immigrants. And so thinking about African American religious history as produced by immigrants is something that I didn't emphasize it enough perhaps in the book, but it was really of interest to me. And so it's American in that it's the product of this particular period in the United States, and migrants are a big part of it, but it's also, I don't know if it would have happened in quite this way without that intersection of immigrants. And so some of the immigrants are a little bit more mobile outside of the U.S., going back and forth. They've traveled before they came, and they also reach out. But Noble Drew Ali went to Panama. He had a hemispheric vision for his group, and I think we have I have one of their identity cards that's in Spanish, so they were in Cuba and Panama. And so I think that there are ways to think about it as distinctly American, but also can't be accounted for entirely through USian frames. If that makes sense.
As a European historian, as I thought about the question and your answer, I thought of Madame Blavatsky and theosophy and the reorienting of religious identity around, sages in the East as an alternative religious identity that may also, I don't know if it has any racial elements, but I think there is a late 19th, early 20th century is a period of religious experimentation, in part because the world is opening up in an imperial setting that is also contested. So I think the world perspective doesn't emerge in this book. It's not your topic, but in a way, it's there. It's there implicitly with Morocco and Ethiopia, not only as imagined places, but as real places where religious changes are influencing Americans. But these changes are going on elsewhere as well. So.
I'm Timothy Ertl from Bethel College locally, and I was curious about why the Rastafari did not appear, and I didn't know if it's because you felt they were outside the dating, or Marcus Garvey's there, and of course he's such an important figure for them, at least mythologically. Whether you felt their racial claims weren't quite as striking, or whether they're in some sense inside of Christianity as opposed to outside of Christianity. I just wondered why they didn't figure more, and you may have very good reasons for them not to.
It's mostly because of the time period I was interested in, and when they would have had influence in the United States would have been just much later. There are good reasons for everything I do cutting off around World War II, and then there are lazy reasons. But I do think the landscape changes after World War II. I mean, that's the arc of the, to a certain extent, the decline of attraction in these groups as the modern civil rights movement gears up, and people are turning to that for certain kinds of political or social claims. And then in that period we get a new, we were just talking about this, a new set of Black Hebrew groups and Rastafari, and so they're different. So I mean, if you go out to a street corner and you see people telling you the real Jews are black, they're likely from these groups that emerge in the 60s and 70s, and their approach to both religion and race is slightly different from these earlier groups. And so it was too much to deal with all of the changes into the next arc.
Thank you.
Can I continue that discussion?
Yeah.
So what is it that's different when they're about the people on the street corner handing out that stuff now? And I'm also thinking about the very first semester I taught after graduate school. I had this student who was a course on history of slavery in the U.S. basically. And so the first day the student made a kind of a speech about how he wasn't a black American, he was Moorish, and he went on, and I didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about. I was like, okay, great, now let's get back to the 17th century. And I now know where, in a sense, where he got that from, or maybe he's getting it from something that's different from your folk, I don't know.
Most of the later groups, the African Hebrew Israelites that are in Dimona, so John Jackson has a wonderful ethnography called Thin Description of that group, and Israeli Church of Universal Practical Knowledge and the House of David. There are like millions of splits in that group. They tend to claim that, so where the groups I wrote about, the earlier generation and the groups now that claim connection to those earlier ones see themselves as among the Jewish people. So people of European descent who call themselves Jews are Jews. People from other contexts. These newer groups claim sole property, right? They are the only Jews. They are the only real Jews. Jews of color. You might see they have these charts that list different. It's a kind of combination of race, ethnicity, and place of origin. So they'll say from Argentina to some other place. Like that's the tribe of this. So they have these charts. So the 12 tribes are only of color, and these earlier groups didn't do that in my reading. The Moorish Science Temple exists today, again, in various factional groupings. Moorish Science Temple of America, there might be a Moorish Science Temple of America in 1929. They have all these different names. So they continue. So that Moorish claim may have been that. There are also, Spencer Dew is working on a project on groups that get talked about now as sovereign citizens groups. So there are like white sovereign citizen groups, and then there are black groups that claims, he calls them Aliyite. So picking up on Noble Drew Ali, he has identified a set of groups now that sometimes get called sovereign citizens, but they claim a connection to Noble Drew Ali. So he talks about them as Aliyites and is looking at Aliyite religion. So that they have different theologies and are interested in indigenous identity in different ways. So there have been changes in that regard as well.
My name is Susanna Krivulska. I'm a PhD candidate here at Notre Dame, and I'm writing a dissertation about religion and Protestant sex scandals in the 19th, 20th century. And so the question is a little bit selfish. You privilege the stories of adherents in the book, as opposed to the kind of scandals of the founders. And I wanted to know more about that process and the choices that you had to make to silence or mute for a moment some of the more sensational stuff in these stories in favor of the stories of the adherents.
Yeah. There's a new documentary about Father Divine that's out, and they edited something I said about the sex scandals. So now I say in that there's no evidence of, and that's all, even though I said something much more complicated. Another version of that question that people ask me a lot is about critique of the groups in terms of, or critique of the leaders in terms of coercive practices and other kinds of abuse. So sex scandals in a broader range of things that might be brought out much more clearly. I think I put an emphasis on the question of what, as you said, what drew people to these movements and what kept them. And as I write early on, most of the contemporary accounts privilege charisma and later accounts as well, right? So these are crazy charismatic leaders, but that obviously can't account for everything. It can't account for people who join after the founder dies, these sorts of things. So how did these religions work to attract people and keep them? And so with that, there was less emphasis on what caused people to leave, and scandal, hypocrisy, violence, divesting them of their money, all these sorts of things happened in lots of the movements. And it's in there to a certain extent, but not as much. I have an article that's just out in, or book chapter, in a collection called Devotions and Desires on Histories of Religion and Sexuality in 20th Century America. And it's not so much scandal, but it picks up on that story of happy S love that's in there and writes more about the context for her, and really thinks and just tries to make a shift from all of the coverage of the salacious coverage of Father Divine and thinking about his sex life to thinking about what, in this case, was what were the religious practices of celibacy in this particular movement. So it's not answering your question. I was just much more interested in these questions than in rehashing what I think has been a lot of attention to for a lot of these groups, the scandalous.
Jana Reese, Religion News Service. So Judith, your book helped connect the dots for me on something that I hadn't realized before. I've done a fair amount of reading into Christian Science, and I'm familiar with the literature there, and a little bit less so with the larger literature of New Thought. And nowhere in there do they talk about both Moorish science and the PM being part of this tradition, heirs of Quimby. Whoa. So it has been kind of erased from that whole historiography, and I didn't realize that the science in Moorish science was like Christian science, religious science, divine science. What happened?
Question. I think there's also strong New Thought frame in the commandment keepers as well. There are some of the healing dietary practices, which again is easy to miss because they're invoking Kabbalistic sensibilities as well. So I think I was surprised to find it in so much. I knew about it in Peace Mission. Jill Watts is the one who's really recovered this story for Father Divine to think about, and Marie Griffith has written about it as well. So the Peace Mission part of it was not a surprise to me, but then thinking about the connections across the other groups, kind of putting them together in the same pool. What happened? I don't know. I think the theologies of these groups have just not been taken seriously. That their performative spectacularness kind of takes over, and the idea that they're fakers who dress strangely and subscribe to invented histories is what has dominated a lot of the literature about them. And thinking seriously about theological connections and sources has not. And Jacob Dorman does a really good job with the Commandment Keepers and Wentworth Matthew. And I think that they just have never been taken seriously at all. And so connecting them to other kinds of religious movements hasn't happened. Emily Clark has written a nice article about the Moorish Science Temple as part of health reform movements and diet reform movements. So all of this kind of work to locate them in American religious history has been hard, and there's still a lot more to be done in that regard.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Pete. I'm a postdoc here at the Cushwa Center. It's a two-part question. First question is about teaching. So I'm wondering maybe the panelists would reflect of how they would teach this in an undergrad classroom, in the syllabus in African American religious history. In my courses on American religious history, I usually assign the autobiography of Malcolm X, and we get into this discussion about tradition, and then we kind of read some of James Baldwin's critiques. So I'm kind of wondering how you teach, how you would teach this in an undergrad class. And some of the students caught onto this critique and said, maybe Malcolm X is making a bunch of stuff up. So I'm wondering, but obviously they place themselves in this sacred narrative and tradition that sustains and gives them meaning. And so that's kind of the rebuttal. But then also, this is the second part of my question, how does this work kind of get us to redefine or rethink the nature of tradition? Because even as we talked about Malcolm X, you can just take the students back to the Christians or the Catholics that were studying anyone. They all have these sacred narratives they tell about themselves that are not substantiated by sort of empirical historical work. So I'm wondering, it's sort of a two-part question. How do you teach this in your courses? And what does it tell us, our students tell us about the nature of tradition and how religious subjects produce that? Because I think that they're hardly alone in reaching back and finding these narratives. And a lot of historical subjects do that for a wide range of reasons within religious tradition. So I'm just kind of wondering about that intervention.
Talk about teaching.
Go ahead.
You're a distinguished teacher.
Yeah, you got a distinguished teacher award.
I will say a couple words and I'll turn it over to you. So I'm actually using something from Judith's other book, Hollywood Be Thy Name, this coming week in class. And then they get a list of movies. They can pick one to watch, one of which is Black Panther, by the way. And I bet a lot of them are going to pick that. But then I'm going to see if they can interpret it within the religious. This is a class on religion and race in American culture that I'm co-teaching with a philosopher. So I'm going to be interested to see whether they can put that movie in the frame that we have covered through the rest of the class. And I suspect that they will not be able to. And I think, I had considered assigning Judith's books for this class, and it happens to be an online class, so I think about what works online and what works in a regular class format. And I actually decided against it because I thought this book needs a lot of explaining to students in an in-person way that is just not going to I can give a lecture online, but who knows if they watch it or not, probably not. And so and so what they're going to do is they're going to give me lots of polemical papers about why these people were wrong about this or that theological point, which of course is not the point at all. And that speaks to I think that speaks to some of the difficulties that would go with teaching this kind of material, because the sort of hidden theological frames of students arise when they see something that they just don't, they see certain kinds of groups that are far enough in the past, like, I don't know, the Moravians or something. They can kind of deal with that. This is kind of strange 18th century people, and that those are interesting historical characters. But these are a little bit too close to us, and they recognize that there are people on street corners making some of the same kind of arguments, and also the fact that they're resistant to placing religion within racial kinds of references, racial frameworks, that is, because of course religion is supposed to be outside of that, because religion is supposed to be this pure thing and not contaminated by all these worldly obsessions that we have. So I've been fighting that battle all semester. So I did assign a little part of my book, Color of Christ, and as I expected, about half of the responses were, the author is wrong because Jesus is not white, which of course is not at all what the book is about, but that's the only way that they can think about that subject, even though there's a sentence that says, our concern is not with this subject at all, period. We're not going to say one thing about it. And I worried about that with this book, so I think the next time I do it, I will assign it, either the whole book or some portion of it, and try to think about, maybe I'll Skype Judith in and have a conversation with her so she can frame it for us. But to me, it's a very challenging thing. And I was just thinking about this earlier also with, I had written this quote down on page 278 that the numbers in the groups that we're talking about are small. And so a typical student response, and honestly, when I was a student, I would have had this response. These are kind of interesting people, but there's only a handful of them, so like, who cares? And of course, Judith's book then shows exactly why they're important. And one of the reasons they're important is it challenged a lot of mainstream believers, as she put it, to refine their own religious and racial identity commitments and make the case for the truth and collective power of their beliefs, as well as providing a kind of alternative to the singular truth to which, in theory, African American people should all subscribe to. And I was thinking about this in the context of our careers, Judith, and what we've chosen to write on. So my philosophy earlier was kind of like the opposite of yours. Like, let's take the biggest groups because they must have been the most important and there's a lot of Baptists. Let's write about Baptists. And I don't apologize for that. There are lots of Baptists and they're important. And I did not understand when I was a younger scholar the kind of questions and approaches that you were bringing. And it's been one of the delights of following your scholarly career to see, to come to grips with a whole different way of approaching the subject of African American religious history. But I'm not sure how to teach it yet. I struggle with that.
That's, well, I mean, I come to it because I didn't even know that Protestants existed until fairly late in my life.
I was pretty aware of that myself.
I wonder about, I'm interested in the popularity of the autobiography of Malcolm X as a classroom text, and I've taught it myself. And I think the question, and I have thought about this a little bit in relation to my goal of everyone just kind of taking that out, taking Fawcett, like I'm out of their syllabus now and slotting my book in there. So that was my goal when I'm writing it. Like, you're teaching African American religious history and you get to the Great Migration and the new religious movements, this is what you're going to teach now. It's a little too long for that. But, so it's not a book that could do the work of talking about African Americans and Islam, and there's great new work on that as well. But I think one of the things that I wonder if we, lots of us use that text, and students like it so much because he repudiates the Nation of Islam. So it's a story that gives you that, this is what Elijah Muhammad was preaching, this is what Farad offered theologically, and Malcolm X realized it was wrong and became a real Muslim. And so I think we all need to check ourselves in terms of how we use that book, if that's what that's what makes it successful in the classroom. I mean, obviously Malcolm X is so incredibly compelling, but so this book cannot get you there, right? This book is about people who are totally dug in on this stuff and believe it against all sorts of, I mean, one of the things I really wanted to bring out was it wasn't fun or a joke or, fantastical performance to them. There were stakes, and people suffered consequences in terms of their families and in relation to the government and all sorts of, there were implications beyond for their choices. So that makes this difficult, I think, in that respect. But I don't know, I Skyped into a lot of classes in the last year or so and visited a couple, and I used it in a course I taught last semester on cult controversies in America, and the students responded pretty well to it. But it came after weeks of me telling them they had to go cult, and that there are no cults. Cults emerge out of controversies when people call things, right? So I had them saying the groups we talk about as cults rather than cults. And so they were prepped for it. But so framing it in a certain way is, I think, called for. But again, I think it's raised the question for me about why we use certain texts at different points in the semester.
Lori Maffley-Kipp, Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you all for your comments. It's really sort of gotten me thinking in new ways. And I can't help but connect this conversation to the conversation 2 days ago at the Knoll Conference on grand narratives, because that sort of raises the same, from the opposite direction, that's sort of the concern about what is a grand narrative, who gets included in it. And John, you made some comments there about that as well, that one of the things that strikes me is that one thing a study like this does, and like Paul's work, and I've tried to sort of work around the edges of mainstream sort of Christianity through Mormons, through African Americans, because I think actually that sheds an enormous amount of light back on the bigger picture. So I wonder if any of you want to say more about how you think Judith's book in particular reflects back on grand narratives. I mean, you've talked around that a little bit, but or the process of writing either about African American religious history more broadly, or writing about American religious history. Because I think for me, that's part of the contribution, is that this is a piece that tells us something about the mainstream, about where you started, Paul, for example.
Go ahead,
People did say to me that just that, like, why focus on these groups? There are so few of them, and so my colleague Wallace Best, in his wonderful book about Chicago and African American religion and the Great Migration, says in the introduction something like, and it's true, that actually there was a period where these groups like these got a lot of attention from Fawcett and on through as single group studies, and there had been less attention to the Protestant mainstream in telling the story of the Great Migration. But he uses language of something like, well, the real story is, and then I thought, well, what happens if we just kind of swing the pendulum back, but not all the way, right, to not just cut off the rest of the story. And in getting, to invoke Paul Harvey. And in doing that, and starting the research for it, I read, and I was just reading sources again, and it's that piece that's, I think it was published in The Crisis, Miles Mark Fisher, in which he's arguing for the inclusion of the Negro sects and cults in the next census of religious bodies. And I had read that so many times. I had taught this document so many times, and I never noticed that he says in it, or it just never really struck me, something like, in the end, it's impossible to tell, to separate these cults, sects and cults, from the mainstream, because people are members of both at the same time. And he tells the story of some Sunday school teacher of his who was a member of a cult and was buried in the church. And that just, it opened up to me a new way of thinking about what it might mean to return to these groups and to do so in a way that puts them in the same, right? Father Divine and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. are, down the street from each other, but they never get spoken of in the same way. So one answer to your question is just to kind of to open up the big narrative in a way that sees these groups as influencing each other. And so that last chapter, which ended up much shorter than earlier drafts of it, was really important. For a while, I just really wanted to finish the book, and I thought, like, I don't want to write this chapter. John Butler left, but he's like, well, if you have one more chapter, just cut it off, say the end. But I took the time and wrote it, and because it was really important for me to think about responses at the time. I mean, I had other versions of it that were about popular culture representations of these groups in literature and film and theater that I never got to, but it just seemed to me that we could no longer proceed as if these groups are over here, and then there's the rest of African American religious history. And so there are probably lots of other cases, examples that we can do that same sort of thing with. Emily's work on spiritualism is like just kind of both pulls that into African American religious history and opens up American religious history in new ways.
You haven't spoken yet. You want to jump in?
We're all on the religion.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I don't know that in sociology we quite have the grand narrative perspective. In fact, I was thinking about this from the opposite point of view, which is that I think as an ethnographer about racial formations and these sort of broader practices is deeply contextualized. And so one thing that I was thinking about a lot when reading your book was that this, to me, sort of reveals the inner workings of a space like New York City or a space like Chicago or a space like Detroit, and the particular kinds of intersections of race, religion, and the state, and sort of everyday life that are not necessarily duplicated across all contexts. And so another way I think possibly to think about this and to frame it differently is that the ways in which people enact their religious selves and their racial selves and their sort of community selves is deeply contextual. And so, what we imagine, things to be like in Utah or Alabama are not the same as they will be in New York or California, and to sort of make sense of that as well. Although the question about teaching the book is, I feel like, far less controversial for me. I was like, I'll teach this in a racial formation class, because the point of that is there are no true racial formations, right? If we take for granted that this is a socially constructed process, this should make a lot of sense and actually reveal things in ways that I think is much more clear to students than it would be, right? I don't have the burden of trying to debate about whether religion is true or not, and so that makes it a little
Wait
bit
till you
easier.
try it.
Yeah, we get stuck with the burden even though we sort of don't want to be stuck with it, and that's one of the entire points of doing it is precisely not to argue that, but it's very hard to get beyond that with students, I think.
I'm John McGreevy, Notre Dame, and thanks for such a rich and interesting book, Judith, and thanks for the commentators too, just really quite extraordinary. So I was kind of like Paul's student, and thinking, okay, what's the overall significance? And I too had highlighted the paragraph on 278, and I'm just going to quote, while the numbers of members in racial groups may have remained small in comparison to the membership of black churches, the newer groups proved influential beyond their numbers. Their presence in the religious landscape of early 20th century black America challenged mainstream black Christians to refine their own religious and racial identity commitments and make the case for the truth and collective power of their beliefs, which I take to be a kind of significance argument. That is, here's why this extraordinarily rich, almost ethnography from a historical point of view, and all these new sources are deployed. I wasn't convinced by that. That is, I don't read this as there's certainly the black press is kind of making fun of these groups and not aware and a little bit challenged by them. I read the story more, but I don't think there's tremendous evidence in here that says the mainstream black churches are worried, really. These are small, numerically small groups. I read the groups more as a fascinating piece of evidence of the kind of what's going to become much bigger in some ways in the 1960s and 1970s, but is there and clearly demonstrated by you now, or rather in the 1920s and 1930s, evidence of a kind of detachment from Protestant Christianity, a detachment from American nationalism, a detachment from a kind of democratic activism. These groups are saying the system is so troubling, we have to reach outside of Protestantism, Christianity, democracy, and find some other kind of powerful identity. And so I was thinking Marcus Garvey was going to be a much bigger presence in the book, in a way, but I see it, recognizing Garvey's complicated, as at the height of Jim Crow in the 20s and 30s, the migration brings people to the north, and their detachment from the system becomes so profound that they develop mythologies of the sacred that pull them out of all the ordinary structures of American life in a way that the mainstream black church and the mainstream black press and others simply do not go there. So that was my first question. Is that a plausible narrative to you or not? And I'd be interested in your reaction to that. And then second, this is more kind of almost philosophical. I take the point, and you make it several times in here, that a conversation about cults and sects is often a conversation about people who define cults and sects, not about the people themselves. Point taken. Do we as religious historians ever get to use the term cult, sect, or superstition? Or in fact, are those, as religious historian, I could see why we wouldn't. As citizen, I could see why we would sometimes use terms like that. So first question is on the significance, and is the significance of these groups their relationship with black Christianity? And I'm arguing maybe it's not. and it's more about their detachment. And then the second question is, how do we think about cult, sex, superstition, and can we even use those terms?
On the significance question, I don't know if I was arguing, that it's about their relationship to Protestant Christianity, but that they are part of this broader landscape of black culture, that they're not, that they're small and they're marginal in some ways, but they're not on the margins in that they are participating in what is a much broader conversation at the time about collective identity, about how race names shape how white people and the white state interacts with the group, and about just history and who we are and how we tell these stories. And so when challenges to the conventional labels and the conventional histories come up, I do think that there is an impact over the longer term that is not about the numbers of members, but about the ways in which their challenges open up certain kinds of new discourses about history and identity. And so, it's much later, but if you think about the history of hip hop and the ways in which you pull some threads and there's more Science Temple all over it. And now there's actually Israelites are, right? Hebrew Israelites are very big in black popular culture and in sometimes hidden ways, right? So that's part of it. I wouldn't say in the end that they were detached from democracy. They certainly wanted to get out of Protestant Christianity for the most part. But again, one of the things that surprised me most was how much, after stepping back and saying these categories are wrong, the hierarchy that these categories produce are wrong, and just your whole idea of who we are and what our history is and what our contribution in the future might be is wrong, then they say, no, this is who we are, and this may be, again, making the ethnic argument, and we want in on this basis, right? We don't want in on that Negro Protestant slave history basis. We want in on this basis. And so they are actually, with the exception of the Nation of Islam, just deeply engaged with democratic politics and with trying to shape what it means to be an American. And even there are surprising ways in which the Nation of Islam is not buying into all of it, right? Rejecting Protestant Christianity, and yet they are appealing to the state for certain kinds of things. So I was saying earlier that I was looking at on Ancestry.com, the Michigan marriage and divorce records are newly available one day when I was on. I was like, all right, let me look up some people.
Exciting.
It was so exciting. And because my question was, if you reject the state, but you endorse marriage in this very conventional way, what do you do? And you have no clergy yet, so it's very early. And also the Moorish Science Temple doesn't quite have clergy yet. And so I found they go to justices of the peace, right? So they're appealing to the government for some kind of recognition that, to me, just said that as much as they're all rejecting aspects of it, they never saw themselves as completely outside of it. The Nation of Islam, most of all. But yeah, I had a lot more defensive language about the significance of these groups in earlier drafts of the introduction. And one of my graduate students read it. She's like, why are you so defensive? It's just interesting. Take it out. I don't think sect is a pretty neutral term, right? So sectarian movement that is in relation to something else. I don't think we can ever, I will never use cult as pointing to some kind of self-evident thing, that there are characteristics of a cult that we all can agree upon, because it assumes some kind of normative commitment that this thing deviates from. So, as does superstition. And so these are not terms that I would use. I think, and in teaching this course last semester, it became really clear to me that and it becomes very awkward, but there are ways in which one can and must talk about, again, coercion, violence, financial improprieties, sexual crimes, things that happen in religious movements. But as I said to my students, these things happen in the things you call churches. And so what are the factors that distinguish something definitively as a cult? It's that you don't believe it, and that it offends your own normative commitments. And so that I call the course cult controversies, for us to look at flashpoint moments in which it becomes really apparent that this group, and this gets back to your first question, reveals the normative commitments of whatever, the majority. So yes, those groups are interesting, and we can talk about the negative elements of them as much as we talk about things that are fascinating, but they're not, to me, there are no absolute characteristics that define something that we would call a cult. And whatever, we're just talking about new revelations in Mormonism this week, right, in the LDS Church, right? These things that we would say, well, that's, I recognize that as a cult. All of those things you'll find in your churches.
Judith, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the visibility question, because I was thinking also about context. And so my understanding, of course, is that nationally these are very small groups, but within the context of highly segregated Black community in these particular spaces, I imagine that they were actually quite visible, especially as some of them own businesses and that kind of thing. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
That's a great point. So in revising, Paul mentioned the story of when Father Divine's rival, Daddy Grace, buys that building.
Daddy Grace, that's right.
So that's a story that, Marie Dahlem's book on Daddy Grace talks about tells this story, right, of how that building, which was the headquarters and his residence, had been rented by some members of the Peace Mission for Father Divine, and Daddy Grace's people buy it, and they eject God from heaven number one. And it's a big thing, and Daddy Grace has James Van Der Zee take up this amazing photograph of him, like on a throne in his new spot. So I'd done work through with a graduate student. We went through the 1940 census. So he buys this building in 1938. So, and then the story is God is, kicked out of his heaven in Harlem. So my student Vaughn Booker and I collected all the information about, and Father Divine's people are so easy to find because they have these names, right? So we read the 1940 census. I think that might be in a footnote there. Found something like 900 residents in Harlem in 70 apartment buildings or something. So I mapped this. And there's Daddy Grace's building, and it's surrounded by the Peace Mission. And just that, actually, I did a lot of mapping to visualize how they were inhabiting these spaces, and it gave me a sense of both, of density that you're talking about. And so that, and I also mapped some of the Father Divine parades, right, the way they took over public space and tried to invest it with their energies, plus the businesses. So Peace Mission is probably the best example of that, but all of them, I agree that the level of visibility then and in these spaces would have been different to what we imagine now.
Hi, Rachel Wheeler from IUPUI. I'm piggybacking a little bit on John's question, and you've partially answered it, but hearing this discussion, it's reminded me so much of my own field of historiography and Native American in particular early, and precisely what you just talked about, of being a little bit surprised at how much these people still were invested in the state. And I think there are very parallel things going on in the 18th, 19th century with Native resistance movements, but also with Native Christians using the language of red, racial language, to argue for a position within the American state. So I found really interesting parallels there. But then also thinking about how, as historians, have kind of sorted ourselves historiographically, and I see, I think, a very similar camps within African American religions and Native American religions, that probably the historian's own political vision of what America is shapes their interest in which subjects they follow, so that we can have the pessimists, the Afro-pessimists, or the Afro-futurists. Is it America tainted by the original sin from which we'll never escape, or is there this possibility of transformation through inclusion? But it seems like what you're talking about is not that this is this tiny little corner that if we include it within the national vision, somehow we have a more diverse, whatever metaphor you want to use. That's not what you're arguing for. I mean, that the importance isn't just an addition of some small piece, which it remains, this one tiny little piece. But it seems like what you're arguing for is a transformation of the way that we imagine what this larger thing is in which all of this is happening, and that if those voices are brought into imagining that this larger conversation, that if we as historians are also creators of a tradition, right? So what does it mean when we write about these subjects and arguing for what that American tradition is? I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
That was a very generous read. And yeah, and I mean, absolutely. And back to the Garvey question, I actually had mapped out an original version of the book, had a chapter on Garvey and on J.A. Rogers, who was also a Jamaican immigrant and a popular historian. He was hugely influential. You can still buy J.A. Rogers books on any book table in Harlem or today. And so I was interested in the ways in which Garvey opened up a kind of a transnational Black political identity, and how J.A. Rogers opened up that Black history in time and space, and also deeply integrated it into world history. And so he was an amateur historian, but he was friends with Arthur Schomburg. He had a column in the Pittsburgh Courier called Your History. And so taking the lead of these people, actually, so I spent a ton of time on Rogers, who his name I just mentioned in the introduction now. But in some ways, taking his lead, right? The ways in which his kind of history was really influential at the time, and influenced, I think, some of these groups, certainly, but he had a much broader readership. And taking his lead of situating Black history in world history was something that was kind of behind my way of thinking about where these groups were located, right? So not just in their corner. So it didn't get into the book, but I think it's, again, something about just kind of tuning my ear to what they were up to and who they were listening to and reading. And in that sense, I think they were on a different kind of scale than scholars and commentators at the time had imagined, and that later historians had put them in. So I don't know if that gets at what you're asking about. But I think they saw their significance, or they picked up on histories of the world that allowed them to resist being cordoned off into some small realm.
I just want to pick up briefly on your phrase, the transformation of the way we imagine this larger thing is, which I think is the genius of this book. Also the genius of Judith's next project on religion and mental illness as well, I would say. And I was thinking about that when I did Through the Storm, Through the Night. The original title was The History of African American Religion, but they only gave me like 140 pages to write this in, book pages, and at the end of writing it, I was like, this is Christianity, it's not religion, it's Christian. So I said, you got to change the title, because there's all these other things I'm not talking about. And there's a good reason for that, because it was a short book, just only do so much. But there's also a not so good reason, because I couldn't quite engage in the transformation of the way we imagine this larger thing is. I didn't quite have the intellectual tools for that. So there's like a paragraph on the Moorish Science Temple in this book, which is about how much I knew about it in 2008 when I wrote it. Maybe I could have written 2 paragraphs, but I didn't know enough to make a big. But also, I didn't know enough to how to use that story to reframe or to reimagine the larger story. And I think what Judith's book does is it gives us an example of how to do that.
Catherine Breckes, Harvard Divinity School. I'm really looking forward to teaching this book, not only for its argument, but for its methodology. So you've said a little bit around the edges about your research, but I know there are a lot of graduate students here, and this book is really innovative in terms of the kinds of sources that it uses. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the research and maybe what you would say to graduate students about what kinds of sources are out there that historians haven't used in the past, but that actually reveal a lot about religion.
There's nothing I like talking about more than research. It was an accident, really. As I said, I thought I was going to work on something like this for my dissertation. And at the time, back in the 80s, I don't know, I was talking with people in my department about how to do that. What would it mean to sort of update Fawcett, to do more on the kinds of things that Arthur Fawcett had done? And I think the conversation turned to ethnography. So let's see what the groups are up to now. And that I'm not, dead people is really, I'm only interested in dead people. And so I didn't want to do ethnography. And so I just let other things came up, and I was interested in other things. And turning back to it, I was teaching a graduate course in, what year was it, 2009 or something, and on this stuff. So Jacob Dorman's book hadn't come out yet, but he had some articles, and so there was new work, Edward Curtis's work on the Nation of Islam. I just wanted to read up on what people were saying and also look at some of the primary sources again. And we were reading Jake's article about Wentworth Matthew, and in which he was talking about how Matthew often, or later in his career, said he was from Nigeria rather than saying kids. And so I got on Ancestry and just was looking for a document to bring into class to show. And I found the draft card. His was the first draft card I found, and it said Hebrew in the race box. And so I taught the course. I was actually I was working on another book, so I wasn't writing this book. And I was working on another book that will not ever happen. And I just sat on it for a long time, and then I thought, hey, maybe these other groups did something like that. So I started searching around in the draft cards database and turned up Moorish American and more Hebrews. And I thought, oh, Father Divine's people probably wrote human, and I put that in and turned up a bunch of these people. And so I realized after that, so 2 things. I was on the verge of wanting to do this book as just a synthetic re-examination through the lens of race. So I was just going to take all the existing secondary sources. And then I realized, no, there are all these questions I have about what members were up to that I couldn't answer from the existing sources. And so stumbling on this draft card just like it was a key that opened this world of government records to me that I had never thought about. One of the things that happened, though, in the course of the research was that Ancestry changed its, whatever this architecture is, software architecture behind that database. So far as I can tell, every of these databases, they all have different kinds of search architecture in that they give you different kinds of choices of what you can search for. And so sometimes, I don't know if they do this anymore, in the census, it used to be like a pull-down menu for race. I think they changed that. But in the draft cards, there was a box. And they had actually indexed it according to, a lot of times, what people had written down, not what the official racial category was. So I was able to turn up these things, but between the time I started and I got somewhere in the middle, they changed that. I could no longer, so if you put some of these categories in, you won't find these. So I stumbled on it by accident. In the census, it only returns the official categories. And so I was actually talking with somebody at Princeton the other day who uses the census in her work, and she said everything is all about like correcting for errors, but you are looking for errors. And so it's so much harder work. But it was just an amazing accidental discovery that there's just so much stuff going on in these vital records. And also, I mean, I used the FBI materials in a way that's really different from how Sylvester uses them, for example. So, the question of surveillance and containment is certainly part of this story, but the FBI files for the Moore Sign Sample are full of just an amazing amount of mundane information that we have because of surveillance, but it's not about control. So the fact that they interview, FBI agents interview some funeral director in Toledo or something. She describes a funeral. Like, that has nothing to do ultimately with, I mean, it does. We get it because of state surveillance. But those kinds of details, the textures of daily life, addresses, I found the Moore Sign Sample got kicked out of some apartment in Camden because their neighbors complained of the smell of frying fish. And like that kind of texture was all over those documents, and nobody had read them in that way, so far as I could tell. So to work with government materials in a way that accounts for state power, but also looks for other things was what was my technique in dealing with these. And there's maybe not enough state power in the book, but there's so much stuff out there. And now, I'm looking at like paperwork for commitment hearings to mental institutions, and they're full of all sorts of things. So court documents and advice, I don't know. Just look at everything is my, don't assume.
I'm thinking about people that I've read who are like East Germans Germans who go and find their Stasi files, and they're amazed by how much mundane stuff the Stasi is just reporting endlessly on the most, what appears to them the most trivial sort of stuff. But a social historian, it's gold mine.
And also, I mean, Emory has a great collection of materials from Father Divine, and there are all these letters to him and from him, and just, somebody could do an amazing piece on the material conditions of Black domestic laborers in America in the 1930s from those letters, because they're writing about theological things, but they're talking a lot just about their material conditions. And so, I mean, that's the opposite. There's just so much stuff in unexpected places. But I really, henceforth, government documents are going to be of interest to me.
I don't see anybody else lining up, so I think we're about ready to conclude. I think for me, thinking about the conversation we've just had, it suggests that the book has an impact well beyond anything like the numbers of people here. It expands both our understanding of American religion in the 20th century, but on the basis of what you just said now, it also expands our understanding of how we can go about learning about these people. So I thought that last comment was wonderfully appropriate. So I'm going to ask you now to join me in thanking our panelists and Judith for a wonderful session.